Welcome to the Explainer. Today we're diving into a genuinely fascinating piece of source material. It honestly reads a bit like a stage play, blending esoteric spiritualism with some surprisingly relatable human frustration. We're going to look at the literal transcript of a public spiritual channeling event, zeroing in on those opening moments to see exactly what happens when ancient history collides with a modern-day interview.
So, think about this for a second. What actually happens when you wake up an ancient king from a 17,000-year nap? I mean, imagine the absolute deepest sleep of your life, multiply that by millennia, and then suddenly you're pulled into a brightly lit room full of people just waiting to ask you questions. Well, as we're about to see, the answer is pretty simple. You wake up extremely grumpy.
To see how this plays out, we're looking at a published transcript of a public spiritual message. We'll be focusing specifically on Chapter 1, which details the summoning of Ra-Mu. This session was conducted by President Ryuho Okawa, and the whole point was to summon the spirit of this purported great king of the ancient Mu Empire, a super-advanced civilization said to have existed around 17,000 years ago. Now, regardless of your personal take on spiritual channeling, this transcript is just utterly captivating as a piece of documentary literature. It vividly captures this awkward, tense, and honestly kind of hilarious interaction between the interviewer and this ancient entity.
What makes this really interesting is the sheer scale of the operation leading up to this exact moment. Right at the beginning of the chapter, the text outlines that this specific channeling of the Mu Empire's great king was recorded as Ryuho Okawa's monumental 777th public spiritual message. So for the organizers, this is a massive milestone, right? It's highly anticipated. They're absolutely expecting a profound, enlightening dialogue to mark the occasion. But as you'll see, the guest of honor had completely different feelings about the schedule.
Before the summoning even officially kicks off, the transcript notes this very revealing disclaimer from Okawa. He openly tells the audience, hey, he might be in a bad mood. He explains that for someone of this ancient, massive stature, preparing the physical and spiritual conditions for communication just isn't a simple matter. He even hints that maybe a lighter, more casual setting would have been better, implying that they're basically trying to force this incredibly heavy, ancient presence into a standard recording session. It perfectly sets the stage. The audience is essentially warned, buckle up, because this spirit does not want to be here.
And man, he was not kidding. When the spirit of Ra-Mu enters the host, we don't get some grand, booming greeting. The literal stage directions written into the transcript paint a picture of sheer awkwardness. First, the host starts rubbing his hands together, murmuring, Then, a documented 15 seconds of total unbroken silence. Just think about that. 15 seconds is a literal eternity when you're sitting in front of a live audience. Then, while he's still rubbing his hands, a heavy sigh, followed by another 5 seconds of complete silence. The transcript portrays this profound, heavy reluctance. The interviewer finally tries to break the ice with a simple, good morning, but the heavy sighs, they just keep coming.
So the interviewer, who is clearly desperate to get the conversation moving, tries a super respectful approach. He brings up a previous book discussing Rama's past teachings on the Mu continent, hoping to flatter the king a bit and get him talking. And Ramu's response? It is brutally blunt. He essentially just goes, sure, I probably taught things back then, but so what? What does that have to do with you? It is a hilariously cold shutdown. The interviewer is trying to have this reverent theological discussion, and the ancient king is treating him like a telemarketer who just interrupted his dinner.
Okay, so polite flattery? Total dead end. You can practically feel the tension in the room through the page. Finally, realizing he just has to address the giant elephant in the room, the interviewer drops all the formalities and goes straight for the most direct question possible. Why the bad mood?
And this brings us to the absolute crux of the conflict. The ancient king finally airs his, honestly, deeply relatable grievance. According to the text, he complains that calling out to someone who's been sleeping for 17,000 years just to have a little chat is basically a bad trick. From his perspective, they didn't respectfully summon an ancient ruler, they just rudely woke a guy up on a whim. The sheer absurdity of applying everyday human irritability, that feeling of having your alarm clock go off way too early to a 17,000-year timeline is exactly what makes this source material so incredibly fun to read.
He goes on to elaborate on this frustration, and he lays out his expectations pretty clearly. He tells the interviewer point blank, you need a grand ceremony to summon me. Basically, for a great king of an advanced ancient empire, you don't just sit in a chair and say hello. You need pomp, you need circumstance, you need a massive formal ritual. You definitely don't just casually ring the doorbell of a deity-level figure. The transcript perfectly captures this massive clash of expectations, modern convenience versus ancient imperial protocol.
Eventually, the session does conclude, and at the very end of the chapter,
Okawa offers this post-session reflection that perfectly wraps up the whole ordeal. He notes, "He entered in a bad mood, and even though he spoke a little after that, he really is a difficult one. It's just this incredibly honest, almost exhausted admission. It shows that even for an experienced spiritual group on their 777th session, dealing with an ancient king who missed out on his grand ceremony is a genuinely tough day at the office."
Which brings us to our final thought for today. Whether you're reading this transcript as a spiritual event or just a really captivating piece of literature, it holds up this brilliant mirror to human nature. It reminds us that wanting a little respect and the simple desire to not be woken up abruptly are apparently universal even across 17 millennia. So I'll leave you with this. If you were an ancient king, peacefully resting for 17,000 years, and someone suddenly yanked you into the 21st century, what kind of grand ceremony would you demand before you agreed to answer a single question? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the fascinating texts around us.